I was contacted maybe a month and a half ago by Gabriel Shipton, who's Julian Assange's brother, and was asked to help coordinate this event for a national, I hate saying tour because it's not like a rock concert thing, but like they're traveling around and talking about Julian's case and what's going on. And it's Gabriel and his father, John, and they are here from Australia to talk about the current status of the case, what's going on with Julian. And then we also have some other panelists. So in addition to John and Gabriel Shipton, we also have Nicolas JS Davis. He's an independent journalist and a researcher for Code Pink and the author of Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. Mara Shlackman is a South Florida attorney and vice president of the South Florida chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. She has worked on many First Amendment cases relating to the rights of participants in political demonstrations. And finally, we have Scott Luxor. He is a veteran journalist with experience in newspapers and digital outlets. He's worked in newspapers as a photojournalist, news designer, interactive graphic artist, videographer, video editor, art director, and writer. Currently, he's an independent journalist. And so we are going to start with allowing John and Gabriel to talk a little bit about what's going on with the case. We're going to start there, and then we have some really good content questions to sort of get a good conversation going.
My name is John Shipton. I'm Julian Assange's father. I'm here with Gabriel Shipton, Julian's brother. We're on a tour of the United States to bring attention to the plight of Julian, and also to give thanks for the support that we've found in the United States when we were here in January, and throughout the last 11 years, the support that filters through from the United States into the worldwide actions for Julian is substantial. Okay. I've got a soft voice. What am I going to do?
You do.
Maybe I stand up.
We need, project.
Project.
Yeah, you could stand. You could take the mic out. You could project, but the mic's for the online people. These people still need you. Yeah.
Understand. So, our concern, what we advocate here on behalf of Julian, is the First Amendment. The truncation of the First Amendment is exemplified by Julian Assange. The charging of Julian Assange with 17 charges from the 1917 Espionage Act is aimed simply to remove from journalists, publishers, and publications, first of all, their prestige, secondly, their ability to comment upon national security matters, and thirdly, their ability to correct the government or allow conversations which go about redirecting the government if the policies are unsuitable to the electorate. These things are really important. Outside of America, we all envy the First Amendment. In Australia, every time there's an election, there's mention of a First Amendment being put to our Constitution, and similarly, there's talk of the Bill of Rights. We don't have a Bill of Rights. So these two great civilizational aspects of the United States Constitution seem to be progressively being abandoned in order to save some embarrassment for an administration that was 10 years ago. And the items in the releases that Julian did were 2010 back 18 years. So this a testimony before Congress by Robert Gates, the ex-Secretary of Defense, said this as follows: "It's embarrassing, but it's brought us no harm and it's caused no harm." So it gives the opportunity for the United States to correct its policies after the electorate in the United States has discussed it amongst themselves. So that's the beauty of the First Amendment, which we, of course, envy right around the world. We want a First Amendment. We want a Bill of Rights. And the United States Constitution is consequently admired in every Western country and copied. Next. Since the Biden administration has been elected, there's been a few improvements already, 3 in number. The Supreme Court, I think you call it the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, or SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, in a majority of 6, a mixed majority, that is people from the left and the conservatives, decided that the extent of the CFA, that's the Computer Fraud Act, the application was too broad and it had to be reduced. So one of the charges that Julian faces is computer intrusion. So this is a sign that the Biden administration is restricting the excesses of the previous administration. The next, 4 New York Times journalists were being pursued secretly over the last 4 years by the Department of Justice. This was appeared in the New York Times newspaper yesterday, that pursuit is being withdrawn. It's no longer the case. Those journalists no longer need to fear a knock on the door and have their computers stolen and their notebooks taken. The third one is the, always forget the name of this newspaper, USA Today. The USA Today had faced subpoenas. This is local knowledge. This had faced subpoenas for the IP addresses of all of those who went online to look at the Florida shootings a couple of months ago. All of those have been withdrawn. So the subpoenas from the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, have been withdrawn. So that's 3 heartening movements from the Biden administration towards reinstituting decent press freedom, freedom of speech, and the First Amendment. But these, for us, are invigorating. For you guys, of course, I make no comment because that's your business. But for us, these movements of the Biden administration under the supervision of the new Attorney General, Merrick Garland, are encouraging. And I reckon the Biden administration ought to be given some acknowledgement and support from the left for this movement. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Gabriel Shipton. I'm Julian's brother. I just want to give you a quick update on where the case is at. On the 4th of January, Julian won his extradition case. The judge rejected the extradition on the basis that if Julian was extradited to the US, it would be, basically a death sentence. And then a few days later, on January 6th, he was denied bail. So now he's still in Belmarsh prison, and he's been there. He's in his 3rd year now of imprisonment in Belmarsh maximum security prison, and he's there without a sentence. He's on remand. So usually people, when I went and visited him, a lot of people there, in the visiting room, they sort of plan what they're going to do when they get out. If they've got a 16-year sentence or an 8-year sentence, they're all looking forward to getting out and, throwing a party and then getting together with their loved ones. But Julian has no sentence, and so we can't make any plans to welcome him home just yet. As my dad said, we're touring. We're working throughout the US. We'll be doing 15 stops across the US, the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West Coast, starting off here in Miami. So, thanks.
Thank you. So we're going to just start. I generally just sort of work from the hip and just sort of go with a discussion. And we have some really good topics here, obviously. And so the first thing that always strikes me about this case is, how can someone who is not a US citizen be indicted under our Espionage Act? It doesn't seem logical to me, right? So we know Julian is an American citizen. How is this possible? So that is something that I would ask you, I would ask Mara. So could you talk a little bit about how the nature of the charge in this case and how he is being charged under the Espionage Act?
My focus in my analysis was on the First Amendment. So I haven't necessarily looked at the extraterritorial application of this to a non-US citizen, but I will say that it is unprecedented that the US government is indicting someone for being a publisher of information. And that is unprecedented. Previous prosecutions under the Espionage Act have been against leakers or other people, and bringing this against someone for publishing classified information. If that prosecution is carried out, it's been said by a number of organizations and individuals that this will be a death knell for national security reporting. And, and those individuals have included James Goodale, who was the counsel for the New York Times and the Pentagon Papers case all the way back in the early 70s. And, and also Max Frankel, who was a editor at the New York Times at the time of the Pentagon Papers, submitted an affidavit then saying that publishing official secrets is essential to any kind of national security, diplomatic, military reporting. So, and the unprecedented nature of this prosecution has also been discussed by Marjorie Cohn, who's the past president of the National Lawyers Guild, Seymour Hersh, who is an investigative reporter of long time standing, has described how his process of getting sources to yield up their classified information that they've obtained. He calls that a seduction, and he says it would be the end of national security reporting if this prosecution against Assange were to be carried out. So that's a major first, that they are pursuing someone for publishing this information. And there have been statements by the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the New Yorker, the Guardian, all in opposition to this prosecution. There was a letter sent to the Department of Justice by 24 organizations in February asking them to drop the indictment of Assange, and those included Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, Reporters Without Borders, and many other organizations, given the unprecedented nature of this prosecution.
So I don't even think I don't need a microphone. So this sort of brings me into what I think is another good question, which is, why are there no protections that we have seen for other whistleblowers in the past? We have whistleblower protections in this country, so why is it that this is not being applied here? And Sandy, this was something that I think you could really talk about. Yeah, just switch it over.
So I'd like to start by talking about another whistleblower, and that was Daniel Ellsberg. And there's a great documentary about him and what he did during the Vietnam War. And it's called The Most Dangerous Man in America. And so what was so dangerous about what he did? What was so dangerous to the American empire was that he exposed that everything the government had been telling the American people about the Vietnam War was a lie, and that the Pentagon all the way through had been, basically creating a complete fiction of what the war was about, how the war was going, and everything to do with it. So by the same token, Julian today is the most dangerous man in the American empire, not to the people of America, but to the empire itself, the Pentagon, the CIA, because they have been lying to us for 20 years about what the war in Iraq, the war on terror, the new Cold War with China and Russia, and what all of this is about. Because what has Julian done? He's simply taken, the government's own documents and allowed the public to see them. The actual, incident reports of military operations in Iraq, the State Department's communications with its embassies around the world, and really, most of all, the first leak of all that got the US attention was the collateral murder video. I expect most of the people listening and watching this have seen that video. If anyone has not, just sat down and watched the collateral murder video that WikiLeaks published, you should, because that reveals the reality of the US occupation of Iraq. It is American troops under orders massacring civilians. And there's a guy in that video who you see, an American soldier going into a minivan that had just been shot up by an Apache attack helicopter and rescuing a little girl who was wounded. And his name was Ethan McCord. And he did quite a lot of media interviews after that, after he got out of the military. And he explained that the battalion commander of those troops, him and all his buddies, and had actually told them after a couple of patrols had come across, IEDs, improvised explosive devices, homemade landmines. He gave them standing orders, standing operating procedure from that point on was, if they were on a patrol and one of their vehicles hit an IED, he said, 360-degree rotational fire, kill every motherfucker on the street. And that was not just talk, okay? Because Ethan said after that, they did have more patrols that hit IEDs, and that is what they did. 360-degree rotational fire in an urban area, streets with, people shopping or whatever. And they killed every motherfucker on the street. And Ethan said what he would do in that situation was actually, because he couldn't disobey the order, so he just shot up at the roofs to make sure he didn't actually hurt anyone, but to look like he was following the order. There have been all sorts of, not as many as there should have been, but there have been court-martials of a few such incidents in Iraq. And the testimony at those court-martials was fascinating, because the soldiers would testify that, we were ordered to kill all military-age males during this operation. We were to treat every Iraqi adult male we encountered as an insurgent, as a resistance fighter. And in another case where some Marines were accused of killing civilians, they testified in court under oath that, we didn't see this as killing civilians. For Marines, all Iraqis are insurgents. So we didn't see this as killing civilians. We saw this as killing the enemy. And this is the reality of the US occupation of Iraq. And this is what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks were guilty of exposing, actually letting the American people know what our troops who are supposedly, according to Barack Obama, the greatest force for good in the world, this is what they were really doing over there.
We're gonna get to questions at the yeah.
Yes, well, this is the difference between being a whistleblower in some little government agency somewhere and being able to go to a lawyer and get whistleblower protections, and someone who actually blows the whistle on the lies of the American empire and the war crimes of the American empire. They are treated very differently. That's the point.
We'll get to things like that, so we're gonna wait till the end of the program to do questions.
Yeah, he's a journalist who made himself available for whistleblowers to come to him.
Actually, that is something that's an important next question, which I'm going to ask you, Scott, because there has been so much debate about, is he worthy of the protections that you would give a journalist? How is this a First Amendment applicable? And does he qualify as a journalist? Which, I mean, technically, no, he's a publisher, and we know that. And I think that people are getting mired down in that distinction. So I was wondering if you would talk to that a little bit, like if it makes a difference whether or not he's a journalist versus a publisher. And I know that Mary, you know about this.
I think Mara can technically answer that better, but I think I'm sure you can. But as a journalist, I think to me the fascinating part of Julian's position in all this is he created something brand new that as journalism has been going through tumult, and everybody knows the whole industry is going through a shakedown, and we're losing staffs, and organizations are changing, and we don't know who's a publisher, who's a journalist, and who's an independent, or who's a corporate entity. And but I think he came in at a time, more than a decade ago, when the internet was really changing journalism. So you could be a publisher, and you could be a producer of content, and you could be an editor, and you could be all of that. And he kind of took on all of that in his own way with WikiLeaks. He created a portal for the free flow of information, which as he's really a global journalist, so it's hard for the United States to really deal with that, because we don't run the world courts, and we don't run world opinion, and we don't control the media around the world. So what he did was not on American soil, and what he did was not from American press freedoms or lack of press freedoms. So I think there's a real quandary here, that he's both a publisher and a producer, and nobody's really prepared to try that, or nobody's confident, I think, that they can either find him guilty or find him innocent or look like a fool in the process. So I think the American government's been kind of stymied. So now I'm glad to hear that the extradition didn't go through, and it's a bigger issue beyond Julian. He's really set things in motion this last decade, and so for the next decade, he's going to help us shape how we handle global journalism, and hopefully it's in a good direction. And I think what even though all the trials, the personal trials that Julian's gone through over the last decade of being, basically house arrest in England, and not being able to really be out in public, all of us journalists have to get together and decide, how do we protect each other in this new age of journalism? How do we deal with internet journalism? How do we protect independent producers? Because he's not with the New York Times. He doesn't have an assortment of lawyers that he can go to, and say, hey, I need some backing. It's just like him and a few others who are actually doing this. So it was very brave of him to do it. And I think he really spun the conversation for everybody forward. And I think as journalists, we need to come together and figure this out. So it will help Julian. It will also help the rest of us. I'm an independent journalist, and it's going to help all of us be able to do impartial, objective journalism, exposing things that need to be exposed and talking about things that need to be talked about, but not to live in fear, so that we don't just constantly have to question ourselves and bury things down and hide from the NSA or the military or whoever is like, you know, trying to get down our throats to quiet people down. So that's really my perspective on it. Did you want to ask something? Yeah.
Sure. So First Amendment protection doesn't depend on being part of what we think of as the institutional press. And at least as early as 1972, in a case called Brandsburg versus Hayes, the Supreme Court said that the right of freedom of the press was a personal right, and it belonged as much to the lonely pamphleteer as it did to a publisher of a major metropolitan paper. So that right doesn't depend upon whether you're with the New York Times or you're someone blogging. And the courts have continued to recognize that and have acknowledged the changes that have come in the media. In the Citizens United case from 2010, which I think most of us know is as a decision that, you know, unfortunately unleashed additional flood of corporate money into politics. But there is some language in that opinion where they say, you know, we don't make a distinction between the institutional press and other speakers, and they mention the fact that you've had a rise of the internet and a decline of broadcast and print media, and it's kind of blurred the distinctions between all these different categories of people who want to express themselves and are expressing themselves on social and political issues. So, you know, it's important to keep that in mind.
I just should add that you know, Julian's been a card-carrying member of this journalists' union for over 10 years, and he's also won journalism prizes, you know, all around the world, 20 plus journalism prizes all around the world. So I don't think there's any real doubt that the work that Julian did, you know, is journalism. So I think, you know, it's important to, particularly when that sort of false narrative where people say that Julian's not a journalist, it's really important to point out that you know, he wins journalism awards all over the world, and you know, he's a card-carrying member of his journalists' union.
Okay, so the question I have then is, have there been other cases like this? I know, Sandy, you had mentioned like that this is not obviously something that we're seeing for the first time. Obviously, this is a very extreme version of it. But could you talk a little bit about things in the past where we've seen similar situations like what's going on with Julian?
So what the US is trying to do with Julian sitting there in Belmarsh prison in London is to extradite him to the United States to face charges for actions that he took in other countries. He's not a US citizen, and yet the US is trying to extradite him to stand trial under the Espionage Act. And, you know, since 2001, we have seen the United States essentially extend a kind of imperial sovereignty over the, you know, the entire world, with, you know, just a few places left in the world that are actually strong enough to reject American imperial sovereignty. I mean, when Edward Snowden had to get out of the US and find somewhere safe to go, he did not have too many options. They were going to come after him almost wherever he went in the world. But, you know, right after September the 11th, you know, we saw the US literally going and just kidnapping people all over the world. CIA agents, you know, jumped an Egyptian guy on the streets of Milan. They worked with the Swedish Secret Service to grab a couple of guys in Sweden and put them on a plane to Guantanamo. And they ended up with 700 or 800 people, you know, 99% of who were completely, utterly innocent, locked up in Guantanamo for years and years and years. Yes, there are still 40 of them there. If any of you have seen The Mauritanian, that's a film that came out recently, telling the story of a guy from Mauritania who they believed he was some kind of right-hand man to bin Laden, because his brother had actually been, I think, bin Laden's driver and made a couple of calls to him on bin Laden's cell phone. So, you know, and he ended up, I think it was 14 years in Guantanamo, something like that. And so, you know, if the US was somehow entitled to do this, you know, to just go and kidnap people and send them to Guantanamo, I mean, this would still be an absolutely shocking abuse of it, to just go around the world kidnapping completely innocent people and doing this to them. But now, over the years, it has sort of refined this process. And it uses the power of the US financial system. It uses the fact that corporations around the world all want to do business or do business in the United States. And, you know, there's now the chief financial officer of one of the largest companies in China, Huawei, who has now spent, I think it's 2 or 3 years, sitting in Vancouver. She was just changing planes in Vancouver, and the US had the Canadian authorities pick her up, detain her, and put her in an extradition trial, like the one that Julian is facing in London. And so, you know, how does the US get to exercise sovereignty over these people who are nationals of other countries, I'm sorry, in other countries? I mean, a Chinese woman in Canada, right now, there's a guy who could be shipped back to the US to stand trial almost any day. His name is Alex Saab. He is actually a Colombian citizen, and he is a Venezuelan diplomat. And he was trying to go around the world and import medicine and essential things that people need in Venezuela that they cannot get because of the US's illegal sanctions on Venezuela. And so the Cape Verde Islands, Cabo Verde, it's 10 little islands in the Atlantic. There's about 500,000 people live there. Little country, no power to stand up to that imperial authority, imperial sovereignty of the US. So when he went to change planes in Cabo Verde, they nabbed him. And he's been sitting there fighting this for the past year. And he very, very likely will end up back in the US facing trial. So this is, you know, we live in a world that since 1945, every country is a member of the United Nations. Since the end of European colonialism in the 50s and 60s, every country is supposed to be independent and sovereign. So what is that, you know, we as Americans have to realize that our country, our government, is just simply using its power, its diplomatic power, backed up by its military power, to exercise a form of sovereignty over much of the world that has no basis in the UN Charter, no basis in international law. It is simply raw power. Might makes right, turning the clock back to the law of the jungle.
Fantastic.
So when we hear all these things, you would wonder why aren't we seeing this on the news? Like, shouldn't we be seeing this on CNN and MSNBC? Like, why aren't they talking about this, given that they're media sources and they are at risk of losing their First Amendment freedoms? Like, why is this not covered? So I'm going to ask you, Scott, like, why do you think this isn't being covered, and what should journalists be doing to not just cover this case, but sort of maybe like, have some sort of solidarity with other people that are speaking truth to power?
Good question. I think we are so, in the US media, and I've seen this over the years, we're so US centric that unless we're directly affected by something that's going on in the world, we really don't pay much attention. We really don't pay much attention to what's going on. So we did hear when Julian lost his ability to stay in the embassy in London, and we did hear the threatening of the extradition, but there's really no conversation going on with Julian, and there's really no conversation going on in the media itself, because I think they feel they're a little bit immune to this somehow, and I don't know why, but there's an obvious link that I think the corporate media feels insulated from transgressions by the government. I think that's unfounded, but I think they feel a little bit like, well, this is kind of a thing out there. It's not something that we're directly affected by. And I wish, and I think, again, the more sensational things that happened with WikiLeaks and things are the things we paid attention to. Like you mentioned, the video that was released from Iraq, which was shocking at the time. And then some of the huge dumps of 50,000 documents at a time. But it's an ongoing, you just don't hear much about WikiLeaks these days. And yet it has affected the New York Times, it affected the Washington Post, it's affected the Guardian, it's affected like the Intercept. He's actually set up a protocol. So like we were talking about, whistleblowers can now submit documents securely because of his actions. And now these bigger media outlets have benefit from it. So I think there's also, I think, a traditional view of who's a journalist and who's not with media outlets. And so if you haven't been through the rigors of working at a small publication, making your way to an editor or doing this and that over here, because of the nature of WikiLeaks, they don't respect it in the same way. That doesn't mean it doesn't deserve the respect. It's just they don't see it the same way. So you see it's kind of a rogue journalist out there. And I think until the big outlets are affected directly by, if they get their way with Assange's case, I think then all of a sudden the bigger outlets are going to start paying attention again, because then they themselves will be affected. But we're just too US centric, I think, in what we're talking about. And this is a global issue. So we need to wake up and get outside our companies.
And maybe, Scott, this is a question you can answer, but I've read a lot of articles that talk about, in this new media environment, a lot of publications have had to cut back their international reporting, their foreign reporting, and as a money saver. And so I wonder if that means a proportionately smaller number of papers are really affected by this, like the New York Times or the Washington Post, the ones that can still afford to have reporters in foreign countries and in the international environment. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on whether that's affecting how the media responds to this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think somewhat, because the internet and the websites now there's so much clickbait, and we're so busy focusing on what gets the most reads. And I go to a news website, and I'm not sure where to start, except for like the top couple of stories on the page. And even that oftentimes is driven by how many people have clicked on it. And so if there's not enough people clicking on it, you kind of don't see it. And that bleeds into your broadcast news. That bleeds into your local news and to a lesser extent, some of the local news outlets. And I think, yeah, the cutting back of the international teams definitely makes a difference, because we don't have an editor-driven business as much as we used to have. I don't say we don't have it anymore, but we don't have as much as we used to have. So if an editor is going, look, this is important, we got to focus on this. They're like, yeah, but this story about the Kardashians has gotten a whole lot more clicks than Julian. All right, well, we'll push that up instead. We'll talk more about that. And it sure as heck does. So that would be, I think, my feeling about both cutting back on the international things, and we're becoming a clickbait media in a lot of ways. Any thoughts on that?
These are two big questions: what to say and what to do. We're using Julian as an iconic illustration of what to do. We go straight to what to say. Over the last 20 years, Gideon Polya, an excess death researcher, estimates that there's been between 6 and 7 million excess deaths in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq. Brown University's study over the same period estimates that there's created 37 million refugees. The destruction of 7 countries, you might remember the list, I forget the name of the general who published it, the destruction of Sudan, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, Syria, parts of Pakistan, the destruction of 7 countries in total or in part. These things have been done by Washington and placed a tremendous burden upon the people of the United States. When I say 6 million excess deaths, all of those people have mothers and fathers, sons, grandfathers, children, sisters, brothers. All of those people weep and hold grief for their loss. When I say 37 million people seeking refuge, they are families who have had their communities destroyed and blown apart, wandering the world seeking succor and sustenance. That's the burden, partial burden really, that the Washington has placed upon the people of the United States. The people of the United States, one way or the other, in establishing small groups here and there, like we do to help Julian, or insisting that the newspapers and news outlets report the actual facts. This is the burden that the people of the United States carry. Further to that, the $6 trillion that's been squandered on these murderous escapades has fallen upon the people of the United States. The infrastructure is ruined. The estimates of repairing the infrastructure in the United States run to $30 trillion. Some thinkers, such as the great American Thomas Merton, postulate that it's not possible to industrialize twice. You can't do it twice, he says. These are the burdens that Washington has placed upon the people of the United States, and you face them now. But that's not my job here to outline that. I simply say that one part of unburdening yourself of these heinous crimes is to free Julian Assange from the persecution so he can go to his family and look after his kids That's one part, and it's a beginning, and a fairly easy beginning. The other part, of course, is to acknowledge the burden of guilt that this places upon, I think the last time I read, 70,000 soldiers over that period have committed suicide. A soldier who comes back to his community with those tremendous burdens of guilt of murderous behavior, it doesn't stop there. He has brothers, sisters, mother and father, and it shatters communities to see their sons so afflicted that they must suicide. So to start with, freeing Julian from the persecution. The last comment is that often procedure is punishment. In the case of Julian Assange, the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, Professor of Law at Glasgow University, has said that we are witnessing a slow motion murder. The procedural irregularities. I'll just give you one simple example. In the court case in February, Julian was in a dock. Now, procedure requires that each side be equally armed. So the prosecution was sitting alongside the lawyers from the United States, and they whisper away to each other for corrections or insights. Julian's lawyers are sitting there, and Julian's in a glass box for terrorists. This 49-year-old intellectual, never hurt a fly, hasn't even got a decent parking fine in his life. The glass box has slots in it like that. The floor of the glass box is raised. To speak to his lawyers, Julian has to get down on his knees and whisper through the slot. The lawyer on the other side has to stand on their tiptoes to hear him. All of the other lawyers in the prosecution side can hear the conversation. So this is not just an isolated example of procedural irregularity. There's been 11 years of it. So whatever position you take, you can say that the punishment has been in the procedure. Send him home. Or you can say that the first act of unburdening the United States people from the crushing policies of Washington is to ensure Julian comes home and that press freedom, in order to participate, in order for the polity, the people of the United States to participate in the administration of their country, that press freedom, and I mean that generally, blogs and commentary on blogs and major newspaper outlets, the press freedom must be reinvigorated. And that rests with the people of the United States having simple conversations over dinner with each other about what's cooking. And getting around with your mates and saying, friends, and saying, well, you know, I discovered this in the newspaper today. What do you reckon? That the SCOTUS has said that the CFAA has been broadly applied, and a lot of people have been banged up for years for no reason, no real reason. So you can say, well, that's an item of repair. Let's push it forward. Anyway, I've spoken too long, but there's a lot of good stuff in there.
No, that was actually really good, because one of our Zoom questions was John present at the trial, and can he speak about that? So I think we answered that. But the question that I see on here that from the Zoom that's really important is, to me, is how does the support in the US for Julian, how does it compare to other places in the world? So I don't know, I mean, if any of you know that, but I'm assuming like that John and Gabriel, that you guys are aware of what's going on worldwide. Like, so can you speak as to how you see our support here versus?
Yeah, so I think amongst like you people, there's a ton of support here in the US. It's very, you know, we've sort of arrived here, and you know, we've received great hospitality. You know, all these, you know, we've managed to set up events across the country, all through local activists and you know, people who care about Julian's cause. So, you know, across the United States, among the people, you know, the support for Julian is great and is growing. So that's how I see the, you know, the support here. But among, you know, I think one area where that needs, you know, in other countries, say in the UK and Australia, there are parliamentary groups that are formed with parliamentarians. You know, each group, the group in the UK has over 20. In Australia, they have 26 from all the major parties. So that's one area that the US really has to, you know, there has to be some progress made there. And I think through what we're doing, through pressure from people on the ground, they can pressure their Congress people or their senators to, you know, support Julian and speak out or you know, form groups, support groups for Julian.
Another good question I had from the Zoom, which anybody can talk to this, and I mean, I have my own thoughts on this, but I'm just trying to sort of be a moderator. But what do you think that the Biden administration will do? And have you noticed any differences between Democrats and Republicans on this issue? So if I don't know if anybody wants to, I mean, I could go on with you guys.
So the support from the Republicans is sort of pretty minor. They have their own particular concerns, and that severely restricts their involvement. The Democrats are much stronger, and particularly in the civil rights movement on the East Coast, they're very good. Elsewhere, there's on Facebook, there's about, I'm told, about 30 million people all up, and a significant number of those are in the United States. So a petition that we did received 600,000 signatures, and 170,000 of those are from the United States. Now that's a petition that's in Australia. So people in the United States have to make the effort to hunt it down and put the signature on. This is pretty significant in my view. So that the how will you say this, politically, the support is nascent and simply needs the stimulus of small groups or us cruising around, and then we leave behind us some energy, and then we come back again for the final push. But yeah, that's the circumstance. That wasn't such a good answer, but you know, we're getting there.
It's a great, I mean, I just don't think there is a difference, and that's part of the problem. I think that they're all just equally ignoring the situation. Something that we got as a question, which I think would be really good for you, Sandy, is how can we push back against extraterritoriality? Did I say that right? Territoriality? That's what was written. Territoriality.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, I don't think most Americans understand this imperial sovereignty that the US government, you know, it uses its power to extend across the world. But it is something we should be aware of. It's something that I've written about quite a bit in, you know, in my articles that I write with Medea Benjamin or by myself. And yes, it's something we need to be aware of. And you know, if we're engaging with our elected officials, we need to make it clear that we don't subscribe to that. We subscribe to the rule of international law, the UN Charter, and the sovereignty of it. You know, Trump made such a huge big deal about American sovereignty. Well, every other country in the world is entitled to that same sovereignty. But we are also obliged to abide by the treaties that we sign. And, you know, the basic principle of the UN Charter is that countries do not interfere in each other's internal affairs. They do not impose unilateral coercive measures on each other, like the sanctions that the US is imposing on Iran and on Venezuela, and for over 50 years on Cuba. And, you know, I think when it comes to the specifics, we are seeing a growing movement against some of these things. It's usually focused more on the specifics. You know, the monthly caravan to support lifting the blockade on Cuba that has been happening in Miami now for what, about a year? And, you know, I mean, there's hundreds of cars coming out the last Sunday of every month to drive through Little Havana and Coral Gables and say, no al bloqueo, no más bloqueo, abajo el bloqueo. And you know, abajo todos los bloqueos, you know, on whether it's on Iran or Venezuela or Cuba or North Korea, even though a lot of those are UN sanctions. But, you know, we are facing so many problems in this century that are going to require cooperation, genuine, good faith cooperation between all the countries of the world, not some kind of abusive, phony leadership by the United States, which simply amounts to arms twisting and bullying. You know, we have to start working with all our neighbors around the world. China and Russia are not our enemies. And so, you know, we got a long way to go.
Okay, so we have a little bit of time. We're gonna, let's open up for questions here first, and then we can get back to Zoom if there's like anything going on. So is there anybody, question? You are gonna get your whole own turn,
Yeah, my question's for John Shipton. I was wondering, considering the fact that the collateral murder video was one of the biggest factors for the United States withdrawing from Iraq, and you know, considering the fact that up to that point, you know, after the Afghan war logs came out and the collateral murder video came out, up to that point, you know, Julian was, I mean, WikiLeaks was focusing a lot on, you know, African dictators and things like that. Of course, the West was applauding him for that. My question is, do you think that if your son knew what was going to happen to him after the Afghan war logs and collateral murder video came out, that he still would have done it?
Oh, gee. You know, it's pretty stubborn. I've never won an argument with him, so I think the answer is probably yeah, he'd take it full on, yeah.
Ty, because he's, you know, he helped us so much, so he gets preference.
Matt, I just want to, unfortunately I've been in and out of this group meeting, but I just want to dispel anybody's idea. I went to the embassy 3 times with Medea to meet with Julian. It was not a nice setup he had there. That was torture on its own.
Yep.
It was a different kind of torture, but it was horrible that he had to spend that time. And the UK, at the behest of the United States, they had 20 or 30 cops there all day long, every day, 365, just watching the embassy.
Wow.
So, I mean, dispel any ideas that that was the picnic, and this is the worst part.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I always thought it was probably not good. Question. There was one.
I just wanted to ask, what can a regular person like myself, a regular American citizen, can do besides joining a group or signing a petition? And also, what kind of real weight do these petitions have? Because I always seem to be signing petitions and I don't know what happens.
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so the question is, what can a regular person do? And does it matter when we sign those petitions that come through to right? I don't really know the answer to the petition question. I don't know if any of you do, but okay, great. And what can we do? And also you might want to add if there's any way people can donate, like if there's any sort of collection that you guys are having.
Yeah, I think, you know, recently in Australia, we had a small petition in one electorate that, you know, the local, you know, the local electorate got a petition together to petition their representative to join the Support Julian group. So I think if you know, those petitions, and then that petition worked. So, you know, got 300 or 400 signatures. It went into the MP's office, and that MP joined the Support Julian group on the basis of the support from his constituents. So I think petitions, they do work, you know, particularly if they're, you know, focused like that. So, you know, your signature does do something on those. You know, and what else you can do is you can call the Justice Department. They have a comment line that you can ring and leave comment, you know, voicing that, you know, you don't agree with this prosecution, and that you want it to be dropped. And you can just talk amongst yourselves, like, you know, that's how ideas start. You talk to each other and, you know, talk about Julian, talk about the case, talk about, you know, press freedoms, the Espionage Act, things like that. And, you know, that's how ideas come up with, you know, between people.
On the live stream. So for anybody who's just listening, or for if you want to know, if you want to call the Justice Department and say something about dropping Julian's case, it's 202-353-1555. And we actually have a link to a script on the bottom of the description. So if you go back and you look at this video on YouTube, there will be a link for a script that we have that can help you leave a message for the Department of Justice. So
just a quickie from the media, and since we're supposed to reflect public opinion, I think from whatever perspective you're coming from, I think in this case, it's just such a clearly, as Mara was talking about, there's a First Amendment issue. So if you can appeal through the media, there's letters to the editors, there's guest editorials. It sounds traditional, but they still have an impact, and they do appear on the internet as well. So when people are doing search engine, you know, searches, they'll appear in a larger circulation publication. Any of them really, bigger ones are of course better, but any of them you get to, if your local paper, your local outlets. So write it thoughtfully from a cross-platform thing, you know, not accusing the right or the left. I think on this kind of an issue, you could really appeal to everybody's freedoms, because I think, like you were talking about, everybody in the United States has this sense of personal freedoms. Even though there's nothing guaranteed in the Constitution, we have this sort of cultural tradition here, and we have the First Amendment. So I would just encourage you, interact with the media, do what you can that way. Get some of you people together to collectively write things too, because more than one writer on a particular editorial can make a difference. So making that pitch.
Add to Gabriel's comment, the petition is specific to the electorate. Okay, so you make the petition specific to those constituents in the local members' electorate, and you only have the signatures of those people who vote for him. And this is really important. And the other thing is that seems to move them along a bit is not to shout at them. So the minute you put up a wall and say you're a nasty piece, he has to steel himself and then invent a counter argument. But if you say, for example, that this is a wrong simply corrected, which will improve the United States standing in the world, consequently, negotiations between states will be easier, then this draws people in. But to say somebody's a dickhead, you know, we just say, well, I'm not a dickhead.
You can't tell the truth.
Jen, if I might.
Yeah. What's good? You have a question.
It's actually a comment. One thing that we all have to remember is that we elect our representatives. And by us electing our representatives, they have to represent what we feel like, right? So if we feel that this is a form of injustice, which it is, right? We should be talking to our elected officials, and they should be representing us, right? So don't think that that's not on the table, because it is.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. Hi. I have a website, ourconstitution.info. I wrote you and sent you some
Oh,
important things.
hi.
Listen, you guys are rational, and I'm very concerned because our representatives absolutely do not do, and they don't have to do anything. They are beholden to big money. They are beholden to the military industrial complex and the CIA. The Julian was bugged, and he is being neuro-tortured. Meltzer has said that, electronically tortured. The Department of Defense is neuro-torturing Americans. If you look up targeted individuals, Julian is not the only one. There are thousands. They want to keep it under wraps. The presidents, the senators know it. That's why they don't do anything, because there's going to be repercussions for them. Neuro-torture, targeted individuals. There is a lady that is trying, and I'm trying to get her coordinated with the groups together, like that we're going to have to get together. This is along the lines of Civil War, slavery, what happened in the Civil Rights Movement. You're talking freedom of speech being, they don't care. The media, Fox doesn't say anything because their bosses tell them, don't say anything. That's what's going on because they're afraid. That's where the money is. That's what the politics is. The people have to stand up now and stand up for our Constitution like we had to do when other times in history. They just don't listen. They don't have to, and they can be very scared. And the military is powerful. They are getting people's DNA through. Don't go look it up. Targeted individual. It is extremely horrid. Julian is being neuro-tortured. Nils Meltzer has said it, along with many of worldwide. There's a lady started a website, Havana Syndrome Cryout.com. She's trying to get people together. I wanted to bring in, I fully support freedom for Snowden and for Assange.
You know what? We can talk about this. Let's move on to questions from everyone. Yeah.
We're going to have to march. That's it.
Yeah.
And that's it. They're not listening to rationality.
Yeah, Glory.
Just to set some context for my question really quick, on World Press Freedom Day, Christophe Delwire and a couple other people from press freedom advocacy groups like Committee to Protect Journalists, they met with Secretary Blinken, and to my knowledge, after asking multiple times, Julian Assange wasn't mentioned once to the Secretary of State of the United States. And even in the Clooney Foundation for Justice Trial Watch, which Edward Fitzgerald, Julian's top lawyer, serves as an advisory member of, there's no mention of Julian on their website or on their trial watch. So my question is, how can we deal with kind of such high levels of NGO co-option in the Assange case, and how can we, and what kind of campaign will it take for the heads, at least, because I know Rebecca Vincent does great work, for the heads of these NGOs at places like Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, Clooney Foundation, how can we get them to actually recognize Julian's case and help to advance this public pressure campaign to release him?
Okay, so the question was, how can we basically corral the NGOs to do what they're supposed to be doing and speaking out for Julian? So I don't know if anybody here can address that, like the best way. Yeah.
Mentioned that there are 24 NGOs signed a petition, which major NGOs, 24, all of the biggest ones, signed a petition and was printed in the New York Times back in January. That's 24 major NGOs offering support to Julian Assange. And that was printed in the New York Times. So they have a lot on their plate, these people, and the support is there, but just the constant flow of things to attend to. Julian's rises and falls, but that's the situation. They will do it on occasion when they're organized by us or somebody else. With Blinken, I think that the Secretary of State's concerns with the matter of Julian Assange is pretty far down the list, actually. Yeah, I would say that, you know, that they have a negotiation in Geneva next week, and they would be preparing for that, you know, a negotiation between the United States and Russia. So on Blinken's thing, they'd be pretty far down the list. On the Department of Justice, it's pretty high on the list. Yeah. I hope that's good.
Question. Yes.
I have a question for Scott, or a comment to you anyway. You expressed some puzzlement at the attitude of mainstream media, such I think you mentioned New York Times, CNN, as to the situation with Assange and press freedom. It occurs to me that that narrative is crucial, and that the government in Washington sets a narrative that defines parameters within which the CNNs and New York Times, they feel safe because they're going to play, even though they may have made, to their experience, have a lot of independence, they're playing within the parameters of that narrative. And I wonder if that doesn't explain that.
So your question was about if the mainstream media it doesn't play within some parameters, and that's sort of an accepted sort of narrative area where they don't want to go outside of that, right? That's why they feel secure. Yeah, I think so. And I think that's been traditionally the case. What's interesting though is I think if the media plays with the internet audience the way they could, Julian's case is very much attractive to people who are interested in edgy stories, just for the sake of edgy stories, right? And to bring attention to that issue, it's very controversial, but not because of Julian, but because everybody's interest involved. And you know, Julian himself isn't really that controversial. It's what he unleashed and what he started. And I think if the press really woke up and said, this is a fascinating area to talk about, let's talk about all the different aspects of it. Because I think they get caught up in the narrative about Julian Assange's case, and that's been moving very slowly for years. But everything else surrounding it is huge. It's a global issue. So I think the press is missing the boat. They're missing the opportunity to really highlight this, which again, I said before, would benefit Julian and WikiLeaks and really press freedom around the world. So you're right, they're playing safe. They're missing an opportunity that exists now, I think, to kind of, I guess, have fun with it in the way of engaging readers and getting people who are interested. If they're going to work with clickbait, then they should really be creative and make it worthwhile. You know, I think that's a good question.
Ty, last question here.
Last question, Sandy. Could you draw some similarities between what's the media hysteria around this Belarusian journalist?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so the question is if we can draw similarities between the Belarusian journalist and what's going on in this case. So, Sandy.
Yeah, well, for anyone who didn't hear the question, Ty just asked me to compare the sort of Western media hysteria over a Belarusian journalist who was, you know, a plane was forced to land in Minsk. He was taken off the plane. He was, you know, I mean, it's very similar, in fact, to what the US does with all these people, except in this case, it actually involved forcing a plane to land and arresting a journalist who was, you know, was facing charges in Belarus. And he's obviously not the only person being detained in Belarus for political reasons. But I think what Tide was asking about is the way these things are covered in the US corporate media. Because, I mean, essentially, you know, I mean, the US corporate media is not unbiased. It is not impartial. It is very, very, very controlled by the US government and the US state. In some ways, the media model that has developed in this country, while the only sort of state broadcaster we have is NPR or PBS, I mean, when I read the New York Times coverage of foreign policy, I feel like I'm reading press releases from the US State Department or the Pentagon. And that, you know, but it's a very cozy, frankly corrupt relationship that does a disservice to the public and the readers of these newspapers or the viewers of these TV stations who are turning to them to find out what's going on in the world. I mean, I'm thinking of like an American, actually my brother-in-law's father in England, this is a guy who taught biochemistry at Princeton and Columbia. And he asked me, he said, you know, when I go back to the States now, I don't know where to turn to get the news, to find out what's going on. And I mean, the British press is not, you know, it's not the best in the world either. I mean, but and the BBC is an organ of the, you know, it's owned by, it's a subdivision of the British Foreign Office. But I mean, one thing I felt as soon as I came to this country back in the 1970s is that the corporate media here is subservient and deferential to the government, the corporate power. It is deferential to power. And by being deferential, when your media, who people turn to find out what's going on, is deferential to power, then, you know, you have to really, I mean, people just have to be more questioning and more creative and turn to different sources. It is now possible with the internet to turn to different sources, to international sources, to find, alternative media has grown leaps and bounds here. I write for Common Dreams and Counterpunch and, you know, all these, you know, all the whole panoply of alternative media. And so as people feel the need to go beyond, you know, CNN and MSNBC, the sort of Punch and Judy show of the right, so-called right and so-called left. You know, there are sources out there to turn to, and I would just really urge people to, you know, go to Link TV and watch the, you know, news from Japan or the news from Al Jazeera. Telesur, yes, go to Telesur. You can find all these sources online. and you will learn a lot more about what's going on in the world than watching that. The other thing that the cable news channels have done is to dumb everything down to where, as Scott said, they no longer have correspondents in different countries around the world. They have gradually dumbed down the news and the audience to where people think that a bunch of people, usually the same people, sitting in a studio in Washington, sort of, just talking around in circles about things, is actually the news. I got news for you. That's not the news. Okay.
And actually, I could say something about that. If you're interested in a really good list of journalism sources, if you go to our website, which is generationalchange.com, we actually have a resources section, and I have a list of journalists, independent sources, people that are actually on the ground doing reporting that is worthwhile. So if there's are there any
last questions here? I hear from Zoom. Do you have something?
Yes.
Okay.
So my question was for you, Mara. I wanted you to talk a little more about the importance of the case in terms of freedom for the media, and also our freedoms as civil population of the world internationally. So that in terms of freedom of speech, but also our own individual rights. What is this case particularly doing to that?
Okay, so the question is, what is this case? What is the implications of this case to our personal rights, First Amendment freedoms, and what was that? Yeah.
Well, one thing I wanted to, I guess, get across about this, is we've been talking a lot about the impact of this for reporting in the national security realm and war and peace and those kinds of issues. And I think what some people might be wondering is, how might this affect me when I'm, maybe working on other issues in my local community, and does this affect me? And I think it does. One of, there's a couple Supreme Court precedents that deal with this, and of course, we probably know best the Pentagon Papers case, and that was where the U.S. government was trying to stop the New York Times and the Washington Post from publishing the Pentagon Papers about the Vietnam War, and the court said that they could not be stopped from publishing those papers, and there's a doctrine called prior restraint, and basically the idea of prior restraint is that we should not be able to keep people from talking or publishing things before they're going to publish them or say them, and there's a heavy presumption against that, and the government has a high burden to establish to be able to prevent you from saying something or publishing something before you say or publish it. What that case did not deal with is, okay, what happens? You've already published it. Can you be punished after the fact because you did publish something, you did say something? And that issue got addressed more in a later case, not specifically in an Espionage Act context, but 30 years later, there was a case called Bart Nikki versus Vopper, 2001. And that was a case where there was a local issue, a local labor dispute between a teachers union and a school board. And there were some people involved in that dispute who were having a conversation about it, and someone somehow intercepted their conversation and recorded it. And then that conversation, that recording, which was a violation of wiretap laws, but that recording then got turned over to a radio host who then played that recording on their radio show. And so the question was, as the court framed it, when you have a source that obtains some material illegally, but then the publisher of that material lawfully obtained it from that source, can the publisher be punished under the First Amendment? and the court held that no, the publisher could not be punished for that when they simply obtained something from someone who themselves had illegally obtained it. And this is played out in other cases in the lower courts. For example, there was a case in the Maryland federal court in 2019 where a lawyer sued the Southern Poverty Law Center and some of its staff because they had published an article about that lawyer's ties to some white supremacist or white nationalist group, and then he got fired from his job. And the way the Southern Poverty Law Center had allegedly obtained the information that they had published was from some guy who had been an accountant for the white nationalist group, and that guy had turned over documents to the Southern Poverty Law Center in violation of some confidentiality agreement he had to sign with the white nationalist group to work for them. And so the lawyer brought some sort of like tort claims, like tortious interference with his rights, and the federal court dismissed those claims on First Amendment grounds, saying, you know, even if it had been illegal for, you know, that guy to turn over those materials to the Southern Poverty Law Center under the Bart Nikki case from the US Supreme Court, you know, they had a First Amendment right to publish that, and, you know, and could not be sued in tort claims for that. So, I mean, I think that's maybe a little closer to, you know, a situation that people, you know, working on local issues might perhaps in some instances come across some, you know, information that some source obtained illegally and then, you know, passed it along. So, you know, I think these things do, you know, have consequences outside the national security realm.
So do you think, sort of real quick, do you think that relates to, it's okay, to like the Chelsea Manning case where somebody, you know, obtained the information, then passed it on to WikiLeaks, and then WikiLeaks published it? So that maybe makes somebody like Chelsea Manning liable, but not the actual publisher.
Which is why she did fine.
Right, yeah.
Right,
Which, so
right.
WikiLeaks was kind of, would be under that ruling immune from prosecution.
Right. Okay, so I have a couple more Zoom questions, and this is for John and Gabriel. Has the family appealed to any other heads of state for support? So yeah, I'm sure you guys could talk on this. Yeah.
Well, President Obrador has offered his support. It's a sitting president. President Lula, I met in Geneva. President Dilma Rousseff declared that she's an ally. Gee, there's a lot of them. I can't remember them all. But the Council of Europe has made a declaration of support. The Human Rights Commission of the Council of Europe has made a declaration of support. The government Foreign Affairs Department of the Austrian government has made a declaration of support. The Parliamentary Assembly of Europe has made a declaration of support. There's lots out there. Thanks.
Yeah, let me just ask him one question. It's like a follow-up since we're down here. So, and this is the last Zoom question, is does John have any views on the testimony of Dean Yates, the Reuters team from Julian's trial?
Dean Yates lives in Tasmania. He's very close to us. He's publishing his book. I think it comes out this week. So I wouldn't want to presage that. Just look up his book next week on the internet and then have a look. It's got a chapter on Julian that's very helpful. Thanks.
Okay, Sandy, you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to say very quickly, talking about heads of state, that Barack Obama did not press charges against Julian Assange. He declined to, and I believe he said something to the effect that it's impossible to sort of separate what Julian Assange did and WikiLeaks did from journalism. Even though his administration convened a grand jury to investigate Julian and WikiLeaks, he did not prosecute him or try to extradite him. And so really, I mean, as with so many other things with Joe Biden, he hasn't come close so far to even resetting on many issues back to Obama's policies. In many ways, on a lot of issues, not all by any means, but on a lot of issues so far, including Julian, this is Trump's second term.
Which you want to? Well, one of the reasons that I originally did my live stream a couple of months ago, that we did a telethon live stream, was to promote this idea of everybody calling the Attorney General's office, the Department of Justice, and basically flooding them with a demand that they drop the case against Julian. I actually believe with Merrick Garland that we have a new opportunity that wasn't necessarily there before. So I think that this is an opportunity that we're in right now. Before we wrap up, I want to thank Earth and Us Farm, which now we can't see it, but we've been hearing these critters. That was nice enough. We did try to find an indoor facility. We tried very hard to find an indoor facility. And given the time of year, given COVID, it was just not going to happen. So this is where we ended up, on a farm. And before we wrap, I want to introduce Pete Seidman. Pete is with Hands Off Venezuela and Cuba. Is that Hands Off Cuba, Venezuela? Okay. And he's going to talk a little bit about what they're dealing with, which is really connected to our empire as a whole and what's going on and what we do to other countries, which is really at the root of what Julian was exposing. So even though this isn't particular to that case, it's very particular locally, and it's an important issue here in Miami. And since this is Miami for Julian, we got to put a little Miami in there. And so this is Pete Seidman, and he's going to talk a little bit about their actions.
Thank you. As I wish that, I'm speaking at the very end of this excellent program, but I'm going to raise some issues and some facts as it relates to Cuba, an island right near us, a city where hundreds of thousands of Cubans live now and where profound changes are going on, which show concretely the importance of the rights that Julian Assange has helped to fight for. And what I want to do is go back to April 6th of 1960, which was only 16 months after the Cuban Revolution. And there was a man named Lester Mallory, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. And Lester Mallory wrote a top secret memorandum to his superior. The subject line of the memo was the decline and fall of Castro. So he was a little off in his timing. The only thing was, the memo was not about the decline of Castro at all. It had several points, like bulleted points. The first point was, the majority of Cubans support Castro. The lowest estimate I have seen is 50%. The second point was, there is no effective political opposition. And then he goes on to bemoan the fact that, quote, communist influence is pervading the government and the body politic at an amazingly fast rate. So despite the public posturing in those Cold War days, where the US counterposed itself as a beacon of democracy against Soviet repression, Washington recognized the popularity of the Cuban Revolution and feared its example during a time when simmering discontent and political explosions were taking place throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. It couldn't say this, it couldn't publicly explain what its policy was. And in the secret memorandum, which was not declassified for 30 years, not until 1992, Mallory explains, quote, the The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. It follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. This was the memorandum that defined US policy towards Cuba since 1960 and still does. Starve people into rebellion against popular governments. The spawn of this secret hatred was the blockade of Cuba that continues to this day, which the Cuban government says has cost the people of the island more than $144 billion. The spawn is in the policies that have been talked about here towards Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and other situations. The need to keep its real despicable goals in Cuba secret and other places also applied to how Washington handled the media. One good example is the self-proclaimed beacon of journalistic integrity known as the New York Times during the run-up to the April 17th Bay of Pigs invasion. The Times became aware of the imminent invasion by mid-January. Its reporters knew the actual date some 2 weeks before the invasion, but it delayed, underplayed, and self-censored the story, its publisher explaining that his, quote, reasons were those of national security, national interest, and above all, concern for the safety of the men who were preparing to offer their lives on the beaches of Cuba. This is the scum of dispossessed rich boys who thought they could get their land back from the Cuban peasants and workers who kicked their butts at the Bay of Pigs. He could have added that he also received direct pressure from the US State Department, phone calls from the Secretary of State to the publisher of the New York Times saying, don't do this. And I think these comments and these words address some of the questions that we've been discussing tonight about the media. They are not just manipulated by the government. They represent the interests of the property that this government defends. It is their interests. That's why they behave the way they do. If it wasn't in their interests, as it was later with the Pentagon Papers, for example, because there was a mass movement against the war in Vietnam and there were divisions within their ranks over that war, the outcome could have been different. So, I don't want to go on too long, but I thought I was going to speak earlier and have more time. So just on the blockade, it remains the biggest obstacle to the development of Cuba, which is a country with so much human resources that even despite the blockade and during the pandemic, they've developed their own vaccines. But the blockade is stopping them from getting the syringes they need to put it into arms. And I'm proud to say that in the United States, there's a project now underway where almost $400,000, I think now, has been raised to buy 10 million syringes under license to go to Cuba from the United States. It's just a wonderful thing that tells us something about our country. And now opposition to the blockade is receiving new reinforcements from, of all places, the Cuban community of Miami, where, as Sandy mentioned, there's been a caravan movement, now 12 caravans, each one larger than the one before, of Miami Cubans saying ya basta to this blockade. These are people who have been growing up here in the United States. I mean, they grew up in Cuba and then they came to the United States, and their idea of what this country was like and what their country was like changed dramatically in the hard school of Uncle Sam University. And now, when Obama opened up relations and relaxed the restrictions during the last 2 years of his term, hundreds of thousands of Cubans went back to Cuba. And they saw their families, they saw the truth about the island. They appreciated their ability, just like all immigrants, to send money to help their family, to travel freely in Cuba. And then Trump came along and shut it all down, passing 240 resolutions in the 4 years of his administration to clamp, to go back to those Mallory policies, to do the damage that he thinks that after 60 years that it hasn't worked, he could make it work now. Those policies were very unpopular, and that is the genesis of the Miami Caravan movement. It's people who don't like what's being done and who are organizing to end the blockade. And they have inspired, out of the streets of Little Havana, caravans now in 20 or 30 cities in the United States, scores of cities around the world, demanding an end to the blockade. The next one here will be June 20th. Usually it's the last Sunday of every month, but June 20th, because that's 3 days before the vote that will be taken at the United Nations on the UN, on the US blockade. Last year, only 3 countries voted in support of the US policy. The only excitement about the outcome of the vote is if there'll be some other little, sellout. United States, Brazil, and Israel. Will there be another country, some little, puppet of the United States that will, well, anyway, we want to put it out in the streets of this country and all over the world on that date that this policy is facing growing opposition. And I urge all of you to join us on June 20th. And you can contact Hands Off Cuba Venezuela Coalition, or Jen will have the information. We'll have the exact address of the assembly area announced in a few days. And thank you very much. Still to be announced for next month. No, this is a license. We have a license from the US Treasury Department. There's people who really worked hard to get this. The syringes are purchased from China, I believe. And, the legalities and the technicalities and the money have been to a large degree resolved at this point. And I think that's something really important.
Absolutely, thank you. So thanks to Pete. Pete actually was really instrumental in helping me do this and put it together when I got a call. Actually, the first thing I did was I thought, oh my God, I got to email Medea. I don't know what to do. And so that was my first email. And then Pete was my second call, and this came together. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Ty. For anyone who doesn't know Ty, he's back there. And thank you, Medea. She's in Peru, yes. Thank you, Medea in Peru. Oh, okay, so good. So Medea will be there for a coup. What isn't that's perfect. Okay, yeah. So I think that's it. I think we're gonna wrap. Does anybody have any final word? I mean, we started late. We're kind of rolling late. Yeah, thank you guys for coming out who came local. It's hot, it's muggy for sure. It's not an ideal situation, but I appreciate it. And thank you for all entertaining my Rube Goldberg. And free Julian Assange. So everybody online, everybody listening on the StreamYard, please call the Department of Justice and leave your message. And our producer, John, did go ahead and put the script in the description below. So you'll be able to do that. And that's it. So check out home run number 4, Julian.org. It's org or com? Org. And that will be the tour that John and Gabriel are embarking on around the country. So you could kind of keep up with what's going on with that. But more importantly, call the DOJ. And yes, if anybody would like to make a contribution, you guys are always used to asking for the contributions. I hate asking for money, but if anybody feels so inclined to make a contribution that would help support their travel expenses, they're traveling around and talking about Julian's case, we would be more than happy to accept. Do we have anything else that we want to say? Check out Generational Change. Hold on one second. You want to share?
Yeah, so home run for Julian, that's with the number 4, Julian.org. Make sure you go to that website. Number is 202-353-1555. And make sure that you call the State Department to let them know that you want the case against Assange to drop. We are not giving up on this. We are going to do it until we're blue in the face or until Julian is free.
That's right.
Okay, so